Hello everyone, it is Mrs. Cooper here, and we are continuing in our discussion of biogeochemical cycles. So we talked about one cycle yesterday. We discussed the water cycle, so we should all have that one cycle filled in. So we are going to be continuing today with number 2, the carbon cycle. So the carbon cycle is going to be our focus. If you notice in parentheses, it does say an oxygen cycle. There will be some reference to maybe oxygen gas, but the focus is going to be how carbon is cycling. And again, these biogeochemical cycles are all about how is matter, not energy, but how is matter, things moving through the earth. And we're focusing on if we start at one point of the earth, like maybe in the atmosphere as a gas, how is that element or that molecule transitioning through different forms to end up in the same point, ending on the same point of the circle. So we're talking about the carbon cycle today, and you can see we have a very similar setup, right? We have some key components. We have the reservoir, which again is where is most of the carbon going to be stored. And then we have a diagram for us to fill in. Now, before we jump into this cycle, at the bottom of our page, we have a big idea, and I thought we could talk about that first and then look at our cycle. So our big idea is about these two processes here. And so what is so great about the carbon cycle is it's going to give us a chance to introduce the processes of photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Now, we have a whole unit coming up on these topics, so we don't have to be experts yet. But we want to be familiar with how they are moving around carbon. And so if we start with photosynthesis, we talked about this last unit. We said that that is when plants use sunlight to make food. But we're focusing on now the process in terms of matter, in terms of carbon. And so what photosynthesis is doing is it is taking in sunlight, yes, but also carbon dioxide gas, which is just CO2. It takes that in from the atmosphere and it uses it to make a carbon, there's that carbon, C for carbon, based sugar. So it uses the gas to then make a solid sugar material that is food. And when that happens, the plants do, they're using the carbon, so they are going to release the oxygen, the O2, back into the atmosphere. Now we have this other process, cellular respiration. This is the process that we do. We know we are consumers, so we do not make our own food, but we will go ahead and maybe consume a plant or something that has eaten a plant, and we will eat this carbon-based sugar, and we will break down that carbon-based sugar, and we will release it back as CO2. That's the gas that we breathe out. Now, we are also going to, as we're breathing, we breathe in, we're going to take in oxygen gas to break down that sugar, and then we will breathe out carbon dioxide. So what we start to see is there's kind of a mini cycle where photosynthesis is taking in CO2 and releasing O2, that's oxygen. And so let me say O2 out. And then cellular respiration, we are breathing in oxygen gas, and then we are breathing CO2 out. So it's kind of a mini cycle going on here with carbon and oxygen, where plants are constantly pulling carbon dioxide in, and then we are breathing it back out. So we are going to see these processes now in our carbon cycle, but I wanted us to get kind of some eyes on it first. Okay, so up here, we've said that, let me make this a little bit thinner, there we go. So our first process in the carbon cycle, if we are going to start with carbon in the atmosphere, step 1 will be photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is that process that we just said. It takes carbon from the atmosphere and it's going to convert it into sugars, into foods. And so the arrows that are showing us the process of plants or algae pulling in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere will be arrow B, right? We can see that going on here. So there's arrow B. And also arrow P, right? We don't want to forget that plants are not the only producers that we have. We also have algae, that small green organism that might be growing on water. So we see that carbon is moving from the atmosphere into living things, into the plants or into the algae. Okay. Now, before we get to cell respiration, which is when, we break down that carbon dioxide, we have to think about the idea of consumption. So cool, plants have now taken carbon in from the atmosphere, but how is that going to be transferred to maybe a consumer? How is it going to be transferred to an herbivore or a carnivore? That's the idea of consumption. So consumers are going to eat other organisms, and as they do that, they are going to be receiving all of the carbon. So this is really how carbon is moving through living things. So let's have a look at our arrows. I'm thinking maybe arrow E, this one right here, is showing consumption. This deer might be consuming some of those plants. Maybe arrow F, this predator is consuming that prey. I think that is looking pretty good so far. So let's go with E and F. E and F as our consumption. Now, before we get to cell respiration, let's do one more. Our idea of decomposition. So as, something eats a plant or eats another living thing, carbon is moving. But how does that carbon get out of living things? So that's our process of decomposition. So when something will maybe pass on, we will be breaking down dead organic material to release carbon back to the atmosphere. So let's see where that is happening. So we have a few arrows to represent decomposition. So I'm thinking arrows H. There's quite a few of them. I think there are 3. Are showing us this decomposition process. We're kind of representing that here with this maybe skull. And it's showing how plants can be broken down and predators and prey can all be broken down. And eventually, those decomposers will release that back to the atmosphere. And so really, what process are they doing? So I'm going to call that, was it H and J? Is they are doing the process of cell respiration. So that's when we break down the carbon that is stored in plants and it is returned back to the atmosphere. So let's recap one more time. So plants pull in carbon through photosynthesis. It can move from plants to animals through maybe first consumption and then decomposition. And the way that it gets returned back is going to be through cell respiration. So as things are breathing, as they are breaking down the foods they just ate for energy, they release carbon dioxide, carbon back into the atmosphere. So that would be looking like maybe our arrow D and G. Okay, so I'll do D and G. So photosynthesis brings carbon to plants. Consumption, decomposition really just moves it around, moves it from living thing to living thing, eventually to non-living, like to dead organisms. We're breaking it down from them. And then cell respiration kind of helps return it back to the atmosphere. Now, if you notice, we already kind of have finished our cycle. We started in the atmosphere, photosynthesis brought it down, cell respiration returned it. Consumption, decomposition just kind of moved it around. But we do have one last component of the carbon cycle. It has a little bit of a human impact aspect. And there's another way that we can release carbon back to the atmosphere, not just by breathing it out, is also this last one, the idea of burning something, anything. Anytime something is burned, it is going to release carbon back to the atmosphere. And so all the remaining arrows are going to be showing the burning. One example of this could be just natural burning. So if I think N is pointing to maybe a forest fire, that burning releases carbon. But our other arrows are pointing to some more human impacts. I believe what we're showing here with K is showing kind of the refinement of fossil fuels. And we know as we burn fossil fuels, maybe in a factory, we are burning them in our car. That is producing carbon dioxide gas that releases to the atmosphere. So it could be a natural burn. It could be more of a fuel kind of burn. Regardless, anytime something is burning, it means it is releasing carbon back to the atmosphere. So that means cell respiration and burning both return it to the atmosphere. Okay, So let's talk about our reservoirs and we will begin. So where do we find carbon, right? That's all a reservoir means. And we kind of have 3 places, not a really overall winner this time. So we can find a lot of carbon in the atmosphere, usually in the form of carbon dioxide gas, but there's the C for carbon. We can find carbon underground through fossil fuels. So things like coal, oil, and natural gas are made of carbon, and when we burn them, that's why it gets released. And then we can also find carbon in living things, right? We said that plants are going to be bringing carbon from the atmosphere to make food, and then it gets transferred from living thing to living thing through consumption and decomposition. So we can find carbon in all those sources. All right, so I will post a screenshot of this, and I think we'll have an extra practice, and we are good. I hope you have a great day.